Okay, we're going to be on in about 30 seconds. Good evening, and welcome to our author series here at UUTC. I'm Jim Hardy. Our guest this evening is Dan T. Carter, Dr. Dan T. Carter, who has a long and distinguished career as a Southern historical scholar, writer, and professor. His focus is on 20th century United States politics, with special attention to the complex history of the post-Civil War American South. He grew up in Florence, South Carolina, and received a BA from the University of South Carolina, an MA from the University of Wisconsin, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dan's teaching career spans over 40 years, beginning at the University of Maryland and the University of Wisconsin, and includes 26 years at Emory University, where he was first appointed as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of History, and then as the William Rand Keenan Jr. University Professor. In 2000, Dan was named the first Educational Foundation Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, from which he retired in 2007 as Professor Emeritus. Dan has taught and lectured around the world, including at Cambridge University, the University of Genoa, and the Netherlands, where in 2009 he was the Dow Research Professor at the Roosevelt Center in Middleburg. He was also a Fulbright lecturer at London's Central Polytechnic. In addition to numerous articles, Dan has written several books, including From George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, Race in the Conservative Counterrevolution, 1963 to 1994, and Scottsboro, A Tragedy of the American South, for which he won the Bancroft Prize in 1970. He was awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize and the Sulzby Prize in Political Science for his book, The Politics of Rage, George Wallace, The Origins of New Conservatism, and the Transformation of American Politics. The Politics of Rage was the foundation of a 4-hour PBS miniseries, which garnered numerous awards, including an Emmy for Dan. In 1991, Dan won the Georgia Governor's Award in the Humanities. Dan continues to write for publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and to serve as a consultant on various historical projects. Dan Carter, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our UUTC Author Series.
Thanks very much, Jim. Nice to be here.
You grew up on a farm east of the small southern city of Florence, South Carolina in the 1940s and 50s. Tell us about your family and some of your earlier memories of that time.
Well, the farm I grew up had been in our family since the 1760s, I think. At least part of it. It had shrunk considerably over the years. If any of you have seen the film Belfast, in which Kenneth Branagh talks about growing up in Belfast in this very, very tightly controlled community, then you have some, without the violence, I should say, you have some idea of the kind of place I grew up. It was a rural community in which it was about the safest place you could possibly be to grow up, unless you went swimming in the creek. That wasn't so safe, but it was a place that was dotted with aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors, in which everybody knew everybody. For a child, it seemed idyllic.
You grew up at a time when Jim Crow was in full force. Tell us about your perceptions of that and what kind of discussions, if any, occurred in your family about race.
And that's easy, Jim. None. Like many Southern families, there were certain things you didn't talk about: mental illness, unexpected pregnancies, and race. You did indirectly. You got it was a kind of osmosis almost. I certainly got a sense of it. My father was a small building contractor, and he had lots of black subcontractors and several black workers for him. And through him, he certainly was a traditional white Southern segregationist, but I did learn a lot, mainly because of his emphasis upon fairness, treating the people that worked for him decently and his subcontractors. He never had any difficulties getting black subcontractors because they knew he'd pay them properly and treat them decently. Call them by their real names rather than boy or whatever. So yeah, you picked up ideas about race, but you really didn't talk about it.
In your forthcoming book, Confederate Ghost Dancer, Asa Carter and the Dream of a White America, you describe your growing awareness as a young boy of the stark division all around you between black and white. Tell us some of the experiences that brought that division into focus for you.
I should say that realizing how important these things were, it really didn't come until later. You have a quite different perspective when it's happening. But there certainly are moments, episodes when you're very aware of it. I think I've talked about it, and I do talk about it in the book. The first one that I distinctly remember is I was on a bus, Greyhound bus, going down to visit my aunt and uncle in Charleston. And at those days, the Greyhound bus just rode down the road, and if you wanted to get on it, you held up a handkerchief and it stopped, and you paid the driver. And in this occasion, just outside Lake City, South Carolina, this elderly, older black woman was by the road with an 8 or 9 year old, probably her granddaughter, I don't know. And she stopped the bus and paid for her to go on to Monk's Corner, which was actually pretty close. And the little girl got on the bus. I don't know whether it was her first time or not, but she sat down in the front seat. And the driver noticed, and he said, move on back. And either she didn't hear him or didn't understand, and she just sat there, and he kept on driving, and he looked up in his mirror and saw she was still there. And he pulled over to the side of the road, and he stood over. He was a big guy. And he began yelling at her, "You get yourself to the back of this bus." And she was paralyzed. She just sat there weeping. And I was trying not to look. I was about the same age, about 10 or 12. I was 12, I think. And finally, there was one older black guy on the back of the bus. Most of us were white. And he got up and walked to the front, and he said, "Honey, come on back with me." And she went back. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is awful. It wasn't that I thought it was awful she had to go to the back of the bus. I thought it was awful that this man yelled at her because you were supposed to be polite to colored people. And this was not being polite, and this was a child. But I didn't think of segregation as being wrong. It was just being cruel to somebody. And there are other moments, where you begin to realize things may not be exactly what you thought they were. I think, in retrospect, the two moments that made the greatest difference. One was I had an uncle of mine who was, a cousin of mine, much older than I was. He had served in World War II in the Navy, and after the war, he began bought a 40-foot schooner and traveled through the Caribbean, delivering supplies to small grocery stores in the Caribbean area and islands there. And one day he was visiting, and they had a kind of a mini rights in 1956, I would say. I was 55, 56. I was 15 or 16 years old, and there had been a kind of disturbance in town. And as a good white Southern boy, I was, of course, resentful of all these damn Yankees coming in and telling us what to do. And I talked about how they had mobilized the sheriff's department And by gosh, they took care of those. It was not a word we used in my family, but I used the word nigger. And my cousin put his hand on me and he said, "Stop." And he said, "Let me tell you about my experience." He said, "When I was in the Seabees in World War II, we had a separate colored Seabees and white Seabees. But when we took the island of Tarawa in preparation for the final assault on Japan, he said, you didn't have time to segregate. You were all working together, and I got to know a lot of the black guys that were working with me, and I came down with dysentery." And he said, "We didn't really have any medical facilities. It was so early in there." And he said, "I thought I was going to die. I wished I was going to die." And he said these two black guys that I had come to know, one from South Carolina, one from Alabama, took care of me. They brought me crackers and whatever I could keep down. And when I saw myself, they cleaned me. And he said they took me to the latrine. And he said, at the end of the time, he said, "I swear I was never going to use that word again." And he said, in some ways, it's a kind of, typical story, white man saved by black man. But he said it made a life change. And I don't think I flipped in any way, but I suddenly thought, this is somebody for whom I have this tremendous admiration and respect. And I think it did begin to get me thinking. And then finally, in 1959, I guess it was, or 60, no, sorry, spring of 60. I was working as a newspaper reporter in Florence, and they had a sit-in. And I went to cover it, and couldn't get in. The Crest 5 and dime guy locked the door, so I went around to the back and came in and started taking pictures. And afterwards, I managed to talk to two of the young demonstrators. I'd never talked. I grew up with black kids like me all the time, but I had never talked to a college student my own age. And as I talked to them and I listened to them, I thought, this is scary. These are kids, kids, young people just like me. And they were so articulate and so brave, really. There were policemen there, but people were yelling at them and screaming at them, and they remained absolutely calm. And I thought, this is not somebody to be afraid of. So I think all of those things come together. You can't quite put your finger on what they are, but you suddenly realize, I don't feel the way I've always felt about race anymore at some point.
I know that, and you've just basically described the deep empathy and compassion you have for the people who experienced the cruelty and injustices of racism. Is it fair to say that compassion has fueled much of your writing and your career? Is that what led you to specialize in Southern history?
No, there were a lot of different, but it certainly played a role. I did 2 years at what was the University of South Carolina at Florence, now Francis Marion State University, and worked full-time as a reporter. Went to school full-time. I joke I was a eunuch for 2 years because I didn't have time for anything except going to school and studying. But when I went to Columbia, I fell in with a group of students, white students there, and with the guidance of a couple of older women who had been both Methodist and both active in the Methodist social justice movement of the 1930s, they helped us form an interracial statewide group. It's the first, as far as I know, the first Deep South interracial group of about 60 students, about 30 black and 30 white. They were students from different colleges around the state. And we met every 3 or 4 weekends. We would meet at some place. We were able to meet down at Penn Community Center in Beaufort, and We could go to Dorchester, Georgia, which was a center that Martin Luther King had set up, and to Highlander Folk School in a group. And during those 2 years, I spent a lot of time with young black men and women my own age. And I'm a garrulous person who talks too much, but I often listened. And I would hear their stories about what it was like to grow up in the Deep South. And my first reaction was guilt. I mean, how in the world can I wear a white skin when I see what these individuals have suffered for years? And then gradually I got to know, this is not names dropping, but I got to know Julian Bond and others that said, guilt is useless. It doesn't do anything. Action is what's important, doing something about it. And you have nothing to feel guilty about unless you do nothing. That was John's refrain was always, the only guilt that comes is when you remain silent. And so, yeah, I think it did probably have a lot to do with it, Jim. Yeah.
I think you spent considerable time going to consciousness raising meetings, teaching people how to protest, demonstrate nonviolently, and I believe even Martin Luther King was at one of those, at least one of those things. And you got to know a number of the key civil rights leaders through that. Tell us a little bit about what you learned in terms of what you were told, how you were told to what to do, and also what not to do.
Well, it was not scary. It was scary at times. I was never involved in the kind of direct action in Mississippi and Alabama where it was really dangerous. About my most dangerous activity was taking part in one brief sit-in, spontaneous in Columbia, and about the worst thing that happened to me was my dean called me in and said plaintively, "Please don't do this again. It got in the papers, and the legislature is going to raise hell with us. So please don't do this again." So I didn't really suffer anything like that. But being with young black students who did, I mean, I visited John Lewis in the hospital in Atlanta after he had been in the Anniston bus burning, and when I walked into the room, I almost didn't recognize him. His whole side of his face was black and blue, and he was swollen all up. And from that, I don't know if any of you have ever listened to John or not, but in any of his, but he always spoke with a slight slur after that. That was really the only effect that he had from that beating. But I didn't experience it, but I saw friends who did. And yeah, that makes you realize not only how lucky you are, but how dangerous it was for these individuals, as we know. So I learned how to roll up in a ball, so if you get kicked, and never to strike back. Thank heavens I never had to use any of that.
Your first book, which became a really major book, was Scottsboro, A Tragedy of the American South, which was published in 1969, so not that many years after the time you describe. Scottsboro boys were 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women aboard a train near Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931. 8 of them were convicted and sentenced to death. Their sentences were later overturned, but they spent many years in prison.
Some of them, 20 years, yes.
The book won the Bancroft Prize in 1970, one of the most prestigious book awards that's given. Tell us what drew you to this story, and I know you must have spent. I've read the book, or at least a good part of it, and it's very meticulously footnoted. So there must have been an incredible amount of research that went into this. Tell us what drew you to that story and why you felt you had to put that kind of effort into it.
Well, what drew me to it was easy. I had been working on a dissertation project which would have been read by 200 people, I suspect, when it was published by a university press. And I discovered that a man who later became a friend at Johns Hopkins was writing on exactly the same subject. And I'd already spent 6 months on it. And I was pretty depressed. And I went to my advisor, George Tyndall, who was the professor there, and I said, Professor Tyndall, I know you don't recommend topics. You want people to come up with their own. I said, but I'm desperate. And he said, well, he had just finished was finishing writing his magnum opus, which is a extraordinary history of the American South between the wars, between World War I and World War II. He said, I've run across this case that not much has been written about. I mean, constitutional scholars have talked about it because it led to 2 major constitutional decisions by the Supreme Court. And he said, but it's very contemporary, and I don't know that there are any records, but you were a newspaper guy, and he said, you might be able to do something with it. And I said, well, what is it? He said, the Scottsboro case. You know about it, of course. I nodded. I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, oh, sure, yeah, of course. And he said, why don't you take a look at it? So I frantically raced over to the library and started trying to find out what the hell this Scottsboro case was about. And I realized I'm really just a storyteller who got a PhD. I thought, this is a great story. And so I began and spent the next year and 2 months, I guess it was. I was fortunate. Chapel Hill gave me a magnificent stipend. $2,400. It was tax-free. This was in 1966, so 65, 66. That was a lot of money. Jane was, she was in the School of Social Work. We had $4,800 between the 2 of us tax-free. We lived like kings and queens. So I set about and to find, and I discovered that quite contrary to the assumption, there was a huge amount of material. I found materials in the Alabama Department of Archives and History and the Justice Department Archives in Washington. I found out that this was the best part about having a Southern accent. The Communist Party represented them initially. And William Patterson, who was head of the International Labor Defense, which was a legal arm of the Communist Party, I found out he was alive. So I called him in Brooklyn and told him what I was doing. And he said, well, nobody knows it, but all our papers, they're not cataloged, but they're at the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. So I said, great. And he said, just tell them I sent you. And I said, well, I'd love to talk to you too. And he said, well, sure, come on. And so Jane and I went up there and got this hole-in-the-wall hotel to stay for 2 weeks and to do research. And I knocked on his door, and he opened the door, and he said, yes. He was in Brooklyn. I said, I'm Dan Carter. He said, what? I said, I'm Dan Carter. He said, you're white. And And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you didn't sound white. So I think he regretted instantly. He found out instead of giving it to a brother, he'd given it to a honky. I think so I had the legal arm of the commune. I had all their papers. And I did something that at that time was very uncommon. Because I'd been a reporter, it never occurred to me not to call people to interview them if they were still alive. So I began calling people, the judge in the case, the prosecutors wouldn't talk to me, one of the prosecutors, but one of the defense lawyers and others. And so in the end, I managed to collect a huge amount of material. And it's something that I look back on with great, almost sorrow, because I'm such a slow writer. I write, rewrite, and I wrote Scottsboro in 10 weeks, 590 pages, I think it was. I was just consumed by it. It was was such a compelling story that I almost didn't have to work at it. I'd spread out my notes and read them, and of course I had a memory back in those days, and would sit down and start typing. You know, that's the thing that has the little keys and everything on it there. So it was not a hard book to write at all. It was a very easy, unlike later books that I wrote. It was, but it was a great opportunity to be able to do the research, to talk to black and white individuals who were still alive. But the judge in the case, there was this Southern judge who became a kind of heroic figure, who became convinced that they were not guilty, and he overturned the verdict. Of course, he was immediately voted out of office, but but I had a chance to talk to Judge Horton, and later NBC used my book to make a film about Judge Horton and the Scottsboro boys. So it was, it's kind of bad to write your best book to begin with and go downhill from then on there. That's
well, some people do, but I don't think you did. And I know the book was turned into a Broadway play, among other things.
Yeah, although I do have some pretty hostile feelings about that. It was made into a Broadway. Is that me? That's all right. Can you hear me still?
Yep.
Okay. It was made into a Broadway. I can't understand why it hasn't been produced again. It's a great play. The guy who did Chicago did it, and it was shown. First I heard about it was when I saw the ads on Broadway, but then when they did it, they moved it from Broadway to Philadelphia, and I was invited to come up and take part in a panel discussion with some of the actors and everything. And I got up there and started talking to two of the main actors, black actors who'd been there. And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you." He said, "We wore out your book preparing for this thing. And everybody, the first thing they did was give everybody a copy of your book." And I said, "Well, where the hell are my royalties then?" But that was a lesson I had learned when Tom Moore did a film based on my book. If it's nonfiction, they don't have to pay you. It's only fictional works that you have to pay somebody the use of. They can sit down, hire some graduate student, do a little bit of research, and that's all it takes. There's no protection for a writer in that situation. So I didn't resent it that much, but I did love the play, though. It's a great play.
Well, we have a lot to cover tonight, but
Yeah.
I want to...
Sorry, I'm pretty long-winded too.
I don't want to change that at all. But I would like you to talk a little bit about the story itself, because it's a real tragedy, and it's so hard to read how these young boys were treated. Would you just kind of tell what was going on at the time, and also these two young women who were supposedly raped by them, which was, of course, not at all true.
Well, it takes place in 1931, which, as all of you know, is in the heart of the Depression, and there were thousands, literally, one estimate is over 100,000 hobos were traveling the country, traveling on trains and whatever. And in this case, there were 9 black teenagers, 2 brothers and 3 others, but they didn't really know each other. They just happened to be on the train together. And
they were on a coal car, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. It was in March, so they were pretty chilly. They were down in what they call a chert car, which is where you have coal in it, trying to get out of the wind. And what they didn't even realize was that there were 2 white young women who were, in fact, part-time prostitutes who had been in Chattanooga and were on their way back to home in Decatur, Alabama. And anyway, a fight broke out between the white hobos and the black hobos, and one of them jumped off the train at a slow rise and called the sheriff and said, these N-word were on this train. So they stopped the train, and at that moment, the two young women, particularly the one who was the brightest of the two, she didn't understand the Mann Act. The Mann Act was that if you an individual carried a woman across the state line for prostitution purposes, you can get up to 20 years in prison under the federal Mann Act. But she thought they were subject to 20 years. And so when the deputies rounded them up, she whispered to her friend, "Tell them we were raped." And so they told the deputy sheriff who stopped the train that they were raped. Well, the problem in the 1930s was if a white woman said black man raped them, that was it. There were no ifs and ands and buts. It didn't matter what the circumstances were. So they were brought to, because it was stopped near Scottsboro, they were brought to the courthouse, and within 11 days the trial was held. There are two lawyers. One of them was suffering from severe Alzheimer's, was senile. The other was so drunk that he had to hold on because he was terrified about defending these black rapists. And he had to hold on to a railing for most of the time. And they mounted no defense whatsoever. And the trial was quickly over, and there were 9, 2 of whom were 14, but they insisted, because one of them was pretty big, he must be 16, so they wrote him down as 16. And the 14-year-old, one of the jurors, hung out for life imprisonment. He said, "I just don't want to let a little nigger boy go to the electric chair at 14. So 8 of the 9 were sentenced to death in the electric chair, including one who was actually 14 years old. And the other was to life imprisonment. And that's when the story really gets complicated, and I don't want to, you have to read the book. Don't buy a used copy. There are too damn many used copies around. There was a struggle between the NAACP and the Communist Party. And the party, I think because they were much more adept than the NAACP was, took over the case, and they did hire superb attorneys, and they took the case to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a major case, it's one of, I guess, in civil rights, probably one of the top dozen cases, they ruled that in such a case, when capital crime was involved, that you had to have adequate legal representation. You couldn't just go through the charade of appointing someone to it. So they got a new trial, and that's when Judge Horton overturned it. And they retried them again, and it went to the Supreme Court again. And this time, the Communist Party won on the grounds that they had systematically excluded all blacks from the jury pool. That was another major Supreme Court case. And finally, in 1937, the state it had caused such embarrassment to the state of Alabama that they, quote, compromised. And 5 of the 9, the youngest 5, and one who was physically incapable of raping anybody, he had syphilis and gonorrhea so bad, they released them, and the other 4 they sentenced to life in prison. They did eventually get out to 1950. So that was the case in a nutshell. But what I think was most important about it was that it really galvanized the black community. We think about the Emmett Till case in the 1950s. Scottsboro was the case in the 1930s, which just enraged blacks. I think it's interesting that when I talk to people, most white Alabamans had only older white Alabama. This is the 1960s now. Had only the vaguest idea of what it was. And I'm telling you, when I talk to black folks who were older, they could tell you trial by trial by trial what happened, because they followed that case so closely. So in that sense, it was not only legally important, constitutionally, but as a kind of mobilization thing, because there were mass protests around the country. You wouldn't believe. If you buy my new book version of it, you'll see there's a picture in Times Square of thousands, and I mean literally tens of thousands, people mobilizing to free the Scottsboro defendants, free the Scottsboro boys.
I'd like to change direction away from the books for just a minute. Slavery and racism pervade all of Southern history and are therefore at the center of all you've studied and written about. You've specialized in the politics of the South since Reconstruction. That history is both deeply troubling and uncomfortably fascinating. I'd like to explore with you your perspective on how racism has shaped Southern culture and Southern politics, especially in the last 70 years. So if you would, I'd like you to begin around 1870 and take us up to the end of World War II.
Wow. I used to devote a full semester to this.
Yeah.
So.
I know. You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I promise I won't do that. I mean, talking about the effects is hard. I mean, you can outline what happened. We think about Reconstruction as after the Civil War, is the period when blacks were politically involved and the world was turned upside down for whites. Reconstruction is really a very brief period. It really didn't begin until 3 years after the war, and in some states it ended within 2 or 3. Virginia, it was over within 3 years. They didn't have 3 years of Reconstruction. And the last Republican biracial governments were overthrown in 1877. That was officially the end of segregation. But there was still this concern on the part of white Southerners. There was something called the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they were concerned the federal government was going to step back in. And so they used all kinds of subterfuges to diminish the political power of blacks. But blacks still voted in the South, not in nearly the numbers they did in Reconstruction, but they continued to vote. And so they used a combination of terror, attacking black political activists, and all kinds of shenanigans with voting laws. That sounds a familiar ring, doesn't it?
Sure
to
does.
try to minimize black voting. And then in 1894, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson basically said, okay. I mean, it was really about school segregation and segregation on buses and so on. I mean, on trains and so on. But basically, it gave the green light to whites to do whatever they wanted in the South, and the result was absolute disenfranchisement. By the year 1905, only about 2% of potential black voters were voting in the South, and those were in a handful of cities or wherever, and they were inconsequential at that point. It really exposed the danger in having a choice of emancipated slaves depending upon whites, because that's what kept Reconstruction going. You had a population of 3.5 million former slaves who, by law for generations, had not been able to read and write, were forbidden from learning to read and write. You had no educated, quote, educated class. You had no middle class. And so you had either northern African Americans who came down and were involved in Reconstruction, or sympathetic whites. And when that disappeared, you were on your own, buddy. And so what I think is the critical two things that happened between 1870 and, say, World War II is that, first of all, and that's the tragic part of it, is the whole notion of white supremacy, which was always there, becomes legally entrenched in the South in every way. And also a kind of enduring contempt for blacks. during that period. The other opposite kind of thing that takes place, though, and this is really turns out to be critical, is that the first thing that emancipated slaves fought for was the right to go to school and to get an education. And of course, it was a crippled education, very poorly supported by the states. Often the disparity was $6 or $7 for whites and $1 or $2 for blacks, but gradually, from the 1870s and 80s onward through the 1930s, and particularly in the 1930s, you began to develop a larger and larger Southern black group. I don't mean that educated people are the most important, but you created the kind of group of people who are able to protect themselves in a better way than emancipated slaves were. So you begin to get an educated group of black Southerners, educated mainly in historically black schools here, who begin agitating in the 20s and 30s, mainly legally, working mostly through the NAACP. And as gradually, I think the New Deal, although Roosevelt was always very cautious about race because he had to depend upon the white South, gradually it's the system begins to turn. It turns in one way educationally, in the sense that the undergirdings of white supremacy, the notion that blacks are inherently genetically inferior, really by the 1940s, no serious person who studies these issues believes that anymore. I mean, beginning with Boas and other anthropologists and then geneticists, we begin to see how much the human race is not that separate. Skin color is one thing, but not the rest. So the kind of intellectual underpinnings of white supremacy are gradually eroded. And the courts begin to follow that. Beginning in the 40s, late 30s, 40s, you begin to get courts that begin to say, all right, yeah, we still have Plessy versus Bergen, separate but equal. But how about the equal now? And it begins in the law schools, it begins in graduate schools. They begin to say, look, if it's not equal, if you don't have graduate programs, say for lawyers in your state or whatever, you got to create one. And if it's not equal, we're going to force you to allow these individuals. So even before Brown versus Board in 1954, there were Oklahoma and Kentucky and in border states, Maryland, blacks were going to graduate programs and going to law schools. And that was the kind of beginning that finally culminates, of course, in Brown versus Board of Education. It's a long, slow process, as they often are. And World War II accelerates that too. I mean, you had a whole generation of over 3 million black soldiers who came home and said, I fought Nazism for 5 years, and now I'm coming back to segregation here. And you begin to get really the growth of a pre-civil rights movement, we might call it, in the South.
And you mentioned the Brown decision in '54, and of course the civil rights movement in the '60s, which was very violent at times.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about those two things and the impact on Southern and, by extension, national politics. How did that change things?
Well, the first impact, of course, was in the South, because it was there that the first court case, even though the court originally talked about ending segregation gradually, I mean, that was basically with all deliberate speed is the phrase they used, which turned out to be very deliberate and less speedy. But it is the civil rights movement, of course, that begins pressing this, and the reaction is violence. And I don't think I've tried to illustrate it in the current book, in the Wallace biography too. I don't think we realize how violent it was. Not only violence in terms of murders and assaults and attacks, but in some ways the more pervasive violence was economic intimidation. So many African Americans were dependent upon whites. And it was ruthless in terms of particular rural areas. If you were a tenant farmer somewhere and you dared to try to get registered to vote, they were there the next day with the sheriff throwing your furniture out on the road there. So it was not only the kind of violence we read about, bombings and so on. You know, there were over 250 bombings and fire bombings in the 5 years after Brown versus Board. So it was violent, but it was also this incredible white resistance. As late as 1957, 80% of white Southerners said they still strongly supported segregation. 10% said they accepted. They didn't like it, but they accepted it. Only a little less than 10% of white Southerners said they were willing and thought it was positive. So you can see how strong the resistance was at that time. And we can't just attribute it to good white folks. It was a constant pressure of the civil rights movement and the extraordinary, and it really is, you're talking about accidents of history. If it had been someone other than Martin Luther King, who became, Americans have always loved to have their black leader. And in a sense, Booker T. Washington was a black leader, the 19th century, late 19th. And in a sense, whites, they liked Martin Luther King outside the South because he didn't make them feel quite so guilty. And he also talked about nonviolence over and over again. But what extraordinarily fortunate the civil rights movement was to have King. Not only was he a brilliant spokesman who could reach out to whites, but he also realized that in America, in which African Americans were 12% of the population, you had to gain the support of whites. You couldn't bring about change without doing that. And that meant you couldn't have, that's why he was always opposed to the Black Power movement. He said, yeah, that may be important in some situations, but we have to create, and he believed in it. I don't mean it was not cynical. He believed in it. But that was part of the genius, that he's able to draw in large numbers of people of both races to get involved, and particularly in the civil rights movement. The problem comes after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1954 and 1955 is 65, is that it goes national. And all of a sudden, a lot of white people, oh, I love those blacks getting up and demanding their rights, or those Negroes doing that. But all of a sudden, it's in your backyard. And now they're talking about integrating schools in Detroit, or they're talking about integrating them in Pittsburgh. And suddenly, that's a little too fast for me. I'm not so sure about that. And that leads, of course, to white backlash. And that's why you get that's why I was always fascinated with George Wallace, because he was the first Southern, up until Wallace, Southern politicians had a totally tin ear for dealing with the Northerners, Northern whites. And they would try to appeal in the most outrageous ways. Well, what Wallace quickly realized, because he was smart as hell, was he quickly realized that you can't. He got elected using the N stuff, the outright race baiting, but when he went national in 1968, 64 a little bit, particularly 68, Wallace becomes a master of coded language. You don't talk about segregation. You don't talk about blacks being inferior or whites superior. You talk about welfare. You talk about busing. You talk about crime. All of these are associated in the minds of whites with blacks. That's reality. We know that from social science data. And so you can talk about race without talking about it. And he simply paves the way. Nixon understands that. I spent 3.5 weeks going through the Nixon papers, and it very quickly dawned on Nixon, even before he was elected in '68, that this guy is my real threat, because these are the people that I can appeal to, white Southerners. But Wallace is there ahead of me, and I've got to figure out how to be even more clever about using racially coded language to appeal to white Southerners. And he wasn't really good at it. I hate to say anything positive about Richard Nixon, I really do. But Nixon did have this sense that he wanted to go down in history as a great president. And that meant he couldn't push too hard. He knew that going down in history as a racist and appealing constantly to race would tarnish that history. So he always drew back. It took somebody like Ronald Reagan, who was a master actor, to be able to pull off that delicate task of appealing to race while at the same, I mean, if somebody said he could announce that he's launching a missile strike, oh shucks, sorry I have to do this, folks, but I'm sending 46 hydrogen bombs into Russia. And everybody'd say, yeah, it sounds reasonable, because he's such a reasonable sounding guy and everything. And Nixon could never pull that off.
You mentioned the white backlash in the North, and I'm wondering how much of a role did busing play in that? Because that was the way that people equalized school districts equalized by because they were segregated basically by real estate.
Sure.
And so, black kids went to one school in their district and the white kids went to a school in their district. And of course the busing was busing white kids to black schools and black kids to white schools. Would you talk just a little bit about the busing issue?
Well, it was certainly, I mean, how could we expect anything else? You have 100 years after Reconstruction, or almost 100 years, of third-rate education for African Americans, fourth-rate education in many cases, and you have an economic system and a political system which relegates black Americans, in some ways almost a majority in some areas, to the very edges of society. And so it's inevitable that when you begin to integrate schools, you're going to have differences. I mean, that's nobody flinches from that reality. That many, not all, but many black students, age by age, grade by grade, would be disadvantaged when the school. And so the immediate response of parents is, I don't want my kids going to school where the teacher's going to have to spend all their time with kids who are behind in their work and so on. So it's not just racism. I mean, I think it was interesting. I knew people who I really don't believe they had a racist bone in their body, but they recoiled immediately from the idea of their kids going to being bused to a school which was heavily black or vice versa. It could be done, but it was often done. Charlotte did a good job for years. It could be done, but it took a lot of commitment and a lot of work, and most communities were not willing to do that, I think.
And I think the schools here in Transylvania County were leaders in North Carolina in that sense.
They were, I won't say fortunate, but the black student population was less than 10%. And it makes it easier than my kids went to elementary school in Atlanta and then to high school. They went to Druid Hills High, which is a very good school, and it was integrated while they were there. In fact, by the time that David graduated, it was 50-50, 50% black, 50% white. And I think it was an extraordinarily successful, David honestly says there was not, mainly because of the teachers and the commitment of the faculty, and they just didn't see that much racial tension. But if you look at it closely, as we did as parents, you saw that the AP classes, for example, you'd have 80% white kids and 20% black kids. And so a kind of internal segregation took place. And as a result, and to this day, Druid Hills is still a pretty integrated school. White flight hasn't taken place. But it reminds you of what an enormous task we have. People in this country want to snap their fingers and say, all right, let's take care of this about the time we need to order a hamburger from McDonald's. And you're talking about, hundreds of years of entrenched isolation and problems, and you're not going to take care of it immediately overnight.
We're going to take a short break in just a minute, but Dan has graciously consented to spend another hour here.
And you graciously, this is the time when you can leave.
But before we do, I think about some of the pictures of integration, the little black girl walking up the steps of the school, and the hatred, the virulent, just violent hatred of people, young people, boys and girls who were high school students who probably, other than that, were just sweet, normal kids. And yet you can just see the faces just distorted by this hatred. Talk about that, would you please?
Well, it's what's the song from South Pacific? You've got to be taught to hate, carefully taught. And I like to see it as a combination of both hate and fear. There is a fascinating story about that. When I went back for the celebration, I can't remember what anniversary it was, of the Little Rock integration, I got to meet two remarkable people. There is a famous photograph of one of the black students who is leaving the school, and there is this white girl behind her, very beautiful young white girl, her face contorted with rage, yelling, "Nigger, nigger, nigger." Well, about 15 years afterwards, that young white girl called up Hazel and said, "I want to have coffee with you." And the two of them became very close friends. And it was, as she said, and I had dinner with her at this conference, and she said, to this day, I don't know what I did. I was 16 years old, and I was caught up in the whole thing. And she said, my family wasn't even that racist. And she said, but all my classmates, and I wanted to be popular, and so I got caught up in the mob thing. And she said, within days, I saw that picture in Life magazine and everywhere, and I thought, I'll never live this down. I'll never live with. They moved. They left Little Rock, but it went with her everywhere she went. But I think her description of being at that age, you want to be a part of everything, and a kind of mob mentality takes on.
Yeah. We're going to break for just about 10 minutes, and then we're going to be back for the second half. We're going to talk about Dan's book on George Wallace and on his forthcoming book on Asa Carter, who many of you may know but didn't realize you knew. And so we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're talking this evening with Dr. Dan T. Carter, noted historian, Southern historian and writer, and we've been talking about his real specialty, which is the Southern history, and which is underlain all across by racism and sometimes violence. Those of us who lived through the 60s remember the pictures of police dogs attacking peaceful demonstrators, fire hoses being turned on them, and George Wallace as governor of Alabama blocking the schoolhouse door and declaring in his inaugural address, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. In your biography of him, The Politics of Rage, you trace Wallace's career and how and why his rhetoric changed over the years. He's a fascinating and influential character. So tell us about George Wallace.
Anybody growing up in the South in the 50s and 60s would certainly have been aware of George Wallace after he ran his campaign in 1962, which is an out-and-out racist campaign. So I knew something about him. And when I was in graduate school at Wisconsin, I did see him speak at the campus student union there. And I realized then, I don't remember much about his talk, frankly, but I realized how skillful he was. That this is not your typical Southern demagogue, you know, who had tin ear for anything except his bigoted voters. That Wallace could size up a crowd. He became a kind of hillbilly humorist and really disarmed the students in many ways. He didn't disarm all of them. I discovered the next day, this was in March in 1964, and Lake Mendota, just on the campus there, was still frozen over. And a group of students had mixed up a barrel of bright red Kool-Aid. And they had gone out, and on the lake, they had written 2 words in 8-foot-high letters on the lake, on the frozen lake. The first one starts with F. I won't elaborate any more than that. And the second one was Wallace, spread out on the lake there. So not everybody was amused by him, but a lot of people were, you know, he sounds reasonable. He wasn't a race baiter. Part of the problem was that Wallace always had the advantage that everybody expected him to come out, you know, angry, and instead he'd come out telling jokes. I mean, the first thing he said, I do remember that, at Wisconsin, is, "Oh, I'm so nice to be here. I get to see all the new long hairstyles and beards," he said, because that was the beginning, you know, of the hippie period there. But then I did a couple of books in the meantime, and when I was teaching a course in the American South from the Civil War, I began thinking about Wallace. No, it wasn't that. I was teaching a course on 20th century Southern American politics, not Southern politics. And I realized when I got to the 1968 presidential campaign, in which Wallace came very close to throwing it in the House of Representatives, that he was barely mentioned. There are already, this was been 87, there are already a number of books written, and I realized, if you'll pardon my French, he was a red-headed bastard at the family reunion. Nobody wanted to talk about him. I mean, Democrats certainly didn't claim him, and Republicans didn't want to admit that they had adopted a lot of his language and tactics, and refined reporters who wrote just, they might have been amused by him at the time, but didn't see him as that important. So I became interested really in writing it then, and spent the next 6 years doing the research on Wallace. And once again, I was lucky in that I had only a lot of materials. He didn't have a lot of written materials. Wallace followed the advice of, wasn't Huey Long, it was his brother, gosh, I've forgotten his name now. Earl, it was Earl. Earl always instructed his friends, he said, don't ever say anything on the telephone that you can't say face to face. And don't ever say anything face to face unless you can't whisper it. And don't ever say anything in a whisper that you can't do with a wink and a nod. And that was Wallace's strategy. He never put anything on paper. And so I had to depend upon interviews. And fortunately, this would have been in the 1980s. And there were a whole group around him who were at that time getting all up in years. And you know, the older you get, the more garrulous you get. You want to talk about, and I was stunned at the number of close aides of his who were willing to sit down and talk. Some of them, quite frankly, in ways that was not always flattering about them. Some of them, I think, were trying to clear their conscience. And so I had that great advantage that I was able to do that. And then I also had a lot of written materials, his speeches, and lots of interviews. So I was able to get at him. And finally, the last ingredient was I got to know his daughter, Peggy. And she was the one member of the family who, from age 15, was just horrified by what her father was doing. And I was never able to get Peggy to even explain why or how but she just said, I just couldn't stand it. Peggy, I spent several hours talking to her, and I think I was able to get her. She loved her father, but still she didn't love anything he did. She ended up being Barack Obama's chair, Democratic Party chair in Alabama when he ran for president. I mean, that's a quick switch. So I had the rich materials to do it. It's still a hard story to tell.
My understanding is, and we all know him as the guy who stood at the door and said segregation now and forever. But he didn't start out that way, did he?
No, he started out, hard to explain, but he started out as a follower of somebody many of you have probably never. Any of you ever heard of Big Jim Folsom? Big Jim was a larger-than-life, 6'8" politician in Alabama who got elected in 1946. And there never has been there's never many Alabama governors, as far as we know, who sired as many illegitimate children. And there's never any governor that drank as much as he did. Never anybody who was as much of a hellraiser as he was. And never anybody who was as racially free of prejudice as Jim Folsom was. He grew up at a time in the 1930s when he believed race was irrelevant. Class was what was important. Economics was what was important.
So Wallace started out, I think, as a lawyer and then became a judge, isn't that right?
But he started in politics very early. He became a lawyer just so he could be a politician. He never wanted to be anything but a politician.
But he was a judge at one time, wasn't he?
Later on, yes, he became a judge,
okay.
yeah. But he worked with Big Jim and became a real follower of Big Jim and tried as well as he could during the 50s to be a racial moderate. He really was. He was on the board of Tuskegee Black University. He made it a practice, and this was very unusual at the time, in his courtroom in insisting that everyone refer to black witnesses by their names, and he always referred to black lawyers when he was a judge as Mr. So-and-so. And that sounds crazy. Of course you do. Didn't happen in Alabama. Judges never called. They called them by their first name if they had a black lawyer there. He was boy, or else he was by his first name. And Wallace was not like that. But then he lost in his first campaign against a real out-and-out racist. And Peggy said, when I talked to her, she said, yeah, I remember my father sat around the table one night and he said, there's some politicians that care about money. And there's some politicians that care about power. Some of them care about both, he said. I don't care about money, and he didn't. He never did. He said, I care about power. And when he lost, he made the decision, and again, it's such an offensive phrase, but he told his friends the night he lost, John Patterson, my opponent, out-niggered me, and I'll never be out-niggered again. And that launched him on this racist course that led to his election in 1962 and 63. It was politics. I mean, I think he convinced himself, but that was really what it was, about power and politics there.
Yeah, part of the book's subtitle is The Origins of the New Conservatism. Tell us what you mean by the new conservatism and how it's evolved into the far-right Republican Party of today, which is dominated by Donald Trump.
It's very different in some ways. I mean, even when he was the most racist, Wallace was a New Deal Democrat. He always supported, he loved to spend money. And he, on state projects, you know, I mean, he'd take a little rake off from them for his political machine, but in that respect, he's quite different. But he learned very early on how to find the rawest points in the psyche of Americans and to pour salt on it and rub it to get votes. He may have been a New Dealer in terms of his economics, but once he got on, I mean, he says he was talking to Louis Eckel, who was the editor of the Florence, Alabama Times, who really scolded him about his use of race in the campaign in '62. And Wallace said, you know, I ran the first time and I tried to talk about good roads and good schools and improving the mental hospitals and all that, and I got beat. And I started running this time and I started talking about niggers and they stomped the floor, he said. And that was his, even when he stopped the overt racism, he kept on finding those issues. He started out, he was a big anti-abortionist, pro-abortionist. He embraced and praised Roe v. Wade. I think I've got a little noise going here, is that right? Here we go. Is that better? I think so. He praised Roe v. Wade. And then when it turned, when he ran for governor the last time, he was adamantly opposed to Roe v. Wade. So because he realized it was an emotional issue that he could grab people with there. But his real contribution was to serve as a kind of way station between the traditional Democratic Party. And it really was. We know that from studies, that for a generation who had grown up believing, associating the Republican Party with civil rights and Reconstruction, the idea of joining the Republicans was anathema to many white Southern Democrats. But Wallace becomes a kind of, as I said, a way station. They vote for Wallace, and then once they've broken away from the Democratic Party, it becomes easier for them then to move into the Republican Party as a whole generation does. He does it in that way, and he also does it in developing, as I said a couple times already, in developing a kind of language for appealing to individuals, including those who are, still want to try this a little bit closer up here, and appealing to individuals who are maybe economically shouldn't be on, for you, but if they can respond to the emotional issues, they do it.
The current political division in our country is deep and often acrimonious and sometimes violent. Much has been written about the culture wars and the role social media and outlets like Fox News have played in fueling that division. Of course, Americans are no strangers to division, most notably during the Civil War and the civil rights and Vietnam War struggles of the 60s and 70s. From your perspective as an historian, talk about how you see today's divisions and your thoughts about where we could be headed.
Well, you're right about periods of great division. I mean, their Civil War, they got a little testy there, but there have been periods where you had real sharp divisions and political rhetoric that seemed over the top. The Great Depression of the 1890s, for example, it was a period where you had a lot of violence, you had the Haymarket bombing and you had anarchists. So it's been here before. What we got used to, I think, in American politics was really 20th century politics, in which everybody accepted the rules of the game. You lose, you congratulate your opponent, and you promise to help him whenever you can, and shake hands, and you go on your way. And you work within certain limits. You can see it in looking at the congressional record. If you go back and look at debates, really going back to the 1920s and teens and earlier, my opponent is the honorable gentleman, because they were all gentlemen, of course. The honorable gentleman, and that reflected the public rhetoric that you had. There were guideposts, and with the exception of a few demagogues from the South who stepped over it, you just you didn't insult somebody and say they were lying or whatever. And that really continued pretty much up until the 1980s and 90s, and it begins to change. I think there's no one person, but one of the key figures is Newt Gingrich, who all of you remember. Gingrich was a young aspiring congressman who started out as a liberal Republican when he was in college, and then when he realized there was no future in that in the South, he suddenly became a hardcore conservative. But beginning in 1988, when he first got elected to Congress, he got money from two foundations. I don't remember the name, right-wing foundations. That's another big change that takes place. You've got right-wing money in a way you didn't have it before. All the superstructure of what Jane Mayer calls dark money was being created in the 60s and 70s. So he got a huge amount of money to hold these workshops, which he and a team of 2 or 3 other people held for young, rising Republicans. And in those workshops, it was really built upon the advice of psychologists and people who had done study groups, in which they focus groups. And the idea was, he said, to create a Manichaean world of light and darkness, of evil and good. And so he would drum into these young Republicans the language you needed to use, and the language how you described Democrats. And it was, I can't remember all the words now, but they were all about ravenous and every word that you can imagine to depict them as not simply somebody who agreed with you, but was threatening the very foundations of America. And while he certainly is not the only person who did that, I think he laid the foundations for it. And that's why I talk about From Wallace to Gingrich, the little shorter book that I wrote. It's that progression of that language in which the rhetoric changes and the temperature changes.
We've got so much to go, and I mean,
know.
so much
Keep
I want.
going.
No,
Yeah.
so much I want to talk about,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that this is only going to be the first time that we're going to get together.
Oh, I think 2 hours is enough.
Your work as an historian and a writer has brought you into close contact with many famous and some infamous people, all of them interesting. For example, I know you sat in former President Jimmy Carter's kitchen and talked to him just a few months after he lost the presidential election to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Tell us about that conversation. Well,
it was actually the first time I met President Carter. I had gone down on behalf of Emory University. He had left, this was in March of 1981. He had been defeated, of course, in November, and had left the White House, gone back to Plains. And for some reason, he wanted to put his library and center at planes. He loved planes. And Ham Jordan, who I knew it was a disaster. And he talked to me, and we talked to the president at Emory. And so I was down there to make a pitch. I was a pitch man with President Carter and spent the day down there. But he's an easy person to talk to. We spent the morning talking about Emory and how we might set up this relationship with Emory. And then Mrs. Carter came out and she said, lunch is ready. And so we went in and she said, I'm sorry. She said, it's just homemade vegetable soup and a cheese sandwich. And that I fixed a few minutes ago. And I said, well, that's nice, but somehow I imagine as an ex-president, hordes of servants hovering around here, and a cook and a chef maybe. And she looked at Carter and said, so did I imagine that. She said, that was not exactly, I found out they had a cleaning person that came in 3 days a week. And this is the unpretentiousness was very unpretentious from her point of view. Anyway, we started talking, and somehow I said, it must have been hard for you to lose to Ronald Reagan, who I said not to speak ill of our president, but is pretty much a lightweight. And he started telling this story about his meeting in December after he had lost. He asked him to come by with his attorney general, and who was going to be his attorney general, and he wanted to talk about all these operations that were going on things that only a president of very high ranking, and he thought Reagan needed to know about. He was totally uninterested, kept looking around, and realized that this is not getting very far. And finally he said, I've got one personal favor I'd like to ask you. Kim Dae-jung is a Korean politician who later won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he said, Kim Dae-jung has been sentenced to death by the Korean dictatorship, military dictatorship, which they had then. And he said, I've criticized him so much that I have no clout. Would you be willing, as the incoming president, to intervene and keep him from being executed? And he said, for the first time, he became interested and leaned forward. And Chung Hee Park was the dictator. And Reagan said, yeah, he said, Chung Hee Park. He said, by God, when those students started acting up, he knew how to deal with them. They mowed them down with machine guns, And he said, when I was governor of California and all those Berkeley hippies started demonstrating, he said, I thought, damn, I wish I could do like Chung Hee Park. And Carter said, I had this sinking feeling. This is the man who's defeated me. Well, the phone rang. And it turned out it was an interview he was doing BBC, and he got up and left. And Mrs. Carter turned to me and she said, we left the White House, whatever the inaugural day was. He has not mentioned his name until that moment. For 2.5 months, he would not mention his name. And that's when I realized, all of us hate to lose, but it really hurt. I mean, that was a horrific thing for him. Yeah.
And of course, that was a lot of his loss, I think, was over the hostages in Iran,
sure,
and the fact that he was unable to get them out.
Get them out on time.
I think true, isn't it, that Iran held the hostages for that
very reason? Till after Reagan was in office.
Yeah. This has been documented. One of the most racist policies in this country over the last 50 years, and last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of this, is America's war on drugs. It's actually, millions of people have died as a result of that war. Millions more lives have been totally ruined. And all at a time as drugs use and availability has increased dramatically, exponentially, since Nixon started the war in '71. And much has been written about the underlying racism. And in early 1990, I think you interviewed John Ehrlichman, who was a senior advisor to Nixon, and he confirmed in that interview that the drug war was really racist based. Tell us what about that.
This is actually in '96 when I was working on the documentary.
Okay.
And he in the course of that interview, I think he probably said it before, but he said, you know, the enemy we wanted to create was the hippies and blacks, he said. And both of them, the war on drugs was a way to link the two of them, in particular blacks. And that's what we ran in the film. It was a little more complicated than that, I think, in that it certainly began the war on drugs was the beginning stage of this. It actually accelerated under Reagan is when it really takes off. And that is in terms of his attorney general was so adamant about getting higher and higher drug penalty things there. But right, it starts under Nixon, and then under Reagan is when it just explodes.
I'm skipping over a lot of questions here that I really want to ask you, but we have to keep going.
That's because I kept talking too much.
I want to spend the last part of our time talking about your new book. Your new book is entitled Confederate Ghost Dancer, Asa Carter and the Dream of a White America. And I think some people here may know Asa Carter by another name. And so why Asa Carter? And I believe you spent quite a long time writing this book.
Don't go there. 20 years.
What took you so long?
Not full time.
What took you so long?
I kept stopping because it's. Let me tell you about him, and then I'll tell you why it was so hard.
All right.
I first got interested in Asa Carter because I knew he was a figure in Alabama politics in the 50s and 60s. When I was working on Wallace, there was a general dispute about who wrote that speech. Wallace didn't write that speech of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so I had heard rumors that this guy named Asa Carter had written it. Well, I knew Carter was a Ku Klux Klansman in the 50s, and most Klansmen you don't think of as being highly literate. I'm sorry, that's a general description, but that's true. And so I was interviewing Seymour Trammell, and who was Wallace's closest aide, and he said, "Oh yeah, Ace wrote that." And I said, "Tell me about him." And he said, "Well, you know, he was amazing." He said he was a Klansman, he said, but he could write. He said he had a magazine called The Southerner, which I found out he did, very slick magazine he produced. And he wrote the speech, and he said, you know, he wrote a movie. He wrote a book that was made into a movie. And I thought, is he crazy? Has he lost his marbles? He's old. He's 70 years old. Well, I'm, of course, 80 now. So, but it was well after that, about a year after that. So I did a little digging about him, and two other people confirmed he had written the speech entirely. So I began digging out a little bit about Asa Carter, but then he kept saying about the movie. He'd written something that was made into a movie. Well, 1989, my son and I are in our den in Atlanta, and we're watching a movie called The Outlaw Josie Wales that Clint Eastwood made into a film. And as the credits rolled along, it got to the end of it, and it said, based upon the book The Outlaw Josie Wales by Forrest Carter. And I thought, Forrest Carter, why is that ringing a bell with me? And then the next morning, I literally woke up, and I thought, Forrest Carter, Asa Carter loved Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. So I got in touch with the Library of Congress, and I asked to see the copyright for the book, and it was the address of Asa Carter. And that's when I realized that Asa Carter and Forrest Carter were the same people. He had been a Klansman, a speechwriter for Wallace, secret speechwriter, and then following a long and very complicated life, he decided there was no future in fighting for segregation anymore, and he remained a racist to the end of his life. But he told his lawyer, "I'm going to make some money," he said. "I'm going to make a lot of money." And he called his family together and said, "I'm going to become somebody else." And he set up this elaborate scheme. I mean, it was hard by the time you get to the 70s to do this, in which he was dark complexion, had dark hair. He had gotten a settlement that I talk about in the book, and he bought a little place down in Florida, and he spent 3 months walking the beaches, getting darker and darker. And then he moves to Texas and introduces himself as Forrest Carter. "I'm half Cherokee American, and I'm a writer. I've never published anything, but I'm a writer." And he turned out to be, I think, I've read a lot about con men. He turned out to be the most brilliant con man I've ever encountered. He fooled everybody into believing he was this Cherokee American. And it gave him a kind of entree that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And he lucked out. Somebody usually send unsolicited manuscripts and nobody pays any attention to them. Well, a woman in New York, he sent a bunch of them out to people. She read it, she liked it. She thought this would make a good movie with Clint Eastwood, this Western. So she gets in touch with Clint Eastwood's partner, and he read it and called Eastwood, and Eastwood read it. And Eastwood told me, he said, "I knew as soon as I read that book, this is something I wanted to do." So it was made into The Outlaw Josie Wales, and then he published another book, and then another book. He published 4 books, the last of which was called The Educational Little Tree. It purported to be a memoir of his growing up as a Cherokee in eastern Tennessee in the mountains. Well, he kept up that charade all through his life. He died in 1979, and gradually his books kind of, petered out as they do after a few years, but his agent was convinced that it had a life again. So she persuaded, she couldn't get anybody else to do it. She got the University of Oklahoma Press to publish it. New Mexico Press, not Oklahoma, University of Mexico Press, to publish it. The first edition was 2,000 copies. They paid the family $500 as a retainer for the copyright. And that was 1987, and by 1991, it had sold 200,000 copies without any. It was New Age. It was about the wisdom of our Cherokee ancestors, and if you didn't do crystals, you could read about wise Indians. So it just took off, and it won the Abbey Award of Best First Book, the Best Book of the Year, and I was following this the whole time.
Taught in elementary schools all over the country.
It was everywhere. And I was following this. I was working on my biography of Wallace by this time, and I thought, anybody can write anything they want to, but don't steal Indians, history and claim this to be a true story. So I got in touch with somebody I knew at the New York Times and did an expose and wrote an article about who he really was. And so instead of selling 400,000 copies, it sold 1 million copies. Which goes to prove there's no such thing as bad publicity. There's only publicity, So, but I was always interested in Asa, and I know we're running out of time here, but not as a major figure. But the more I investigated them, I thought about he wrote a lot. He had over 50, he was a radio commentator, and I managed to get hold of some of his audio tapes. his magazine that he published, 2 magazines that he published, lots of speeches reported, but I kept dropping the project. It was just too hard. He was a terrorist. He never, you're trying to write about somebody who's underground the whole time. And I tried to interview people. I got threatened, I mean seriously threatened, by people around him and his family because they didn't want this to come out. That was when I first tried to talk to them. And after I blew up, they had a deal with Disney going for $6 million, and my New York Times op-ed sunk it. You can imagine they were not too happy with me. And finally, what really did it, Jim, was a kind of tragedy that has benefited me. Fred Berger was a reporter for the Anniston, good old boy from North Alabama there, who interviewed over 200 people about Asa. He was obsessed with Asa Carter. And I think he wanted to write a book, but he never did, never wrote anything. He died suddenly, had a heart attack and died. And his brother turned ghoulishly. I asked the librarian in Anniston if they knew what happened to any of his. I didn't know about these interviews. And he got in touch with his brother, his only surviving relative. And he said, look, I'd love for somebody to use them. Fred spent years doing this. So I ended up with 255 hours of audio tapes. And that was when I realized I could do it, that I had the material now of all the people that Fred had been able to interview that would never talk to me. And after great difficulties, he had the worst recording device in world history. I paid a fortune to have a company in Cambridge clean it up as best they could. And so that allowed me to.
I asked you at one time about that because now we have speech to text.
Yes,
and I
use
I
that.
think you told me that the software couldn't understand the Southern accent.
It cannot do Southern. My favorite is when there's one section in which the text says they're closing the pet store or something like that. And I listened to it carefully. And what the guy says, that dog won't hunt. And somehow artificial intelligence decided that was what it was. But I had to listen to hours and hours and hours of it. The reason I'm really fascinated with him is all of these ideas. He was a part of a network of far-right people going back to his World War II days, anti-Semites, racists, and white Christian nationalists, and they called themselves that. The problem was when he was coming along in the 50s and 60s, you couldn't coalesce. They were scattered all over the place. Respectable journalists wouldn't touch them. You had 3 networks. They certainly weren't going to give them any access. But all of these ideas I saw in Carter and his friends. It forms a template. And when the internet comes along and social media comes along, suddenly you can create a national, I don't mean that that's the only explanation, but suddenly all these disparate kind of groups that are scattered all over the place, they come together, and they come together on the internet. And so even though he wasn't a major figure, the question I began the epilogue with is he really worth writing about, talking about? And I hope he is, but that'll be left up to, people who are reading the book.
It's a fascinating story. There's a lot of violence in it. And one of the things that struck me, having grown up in the North and not really being in touch with all of this, was the virulent racism against Jews.
Yeah.
And all of the violence that was created or that was perpetrated against people who were Jewish.
Yeah.
And so we don't really hear that much about that, but probably as much in terms of the racist part of it, as much there as against black people.
And it was that's really the national tie, I think, between Southern racists and Northern racists there, because a lot of Northern racists didn't have that many blacks. But they hated Jews. It's a long tradition. It goes back to the 19th century. But it's a small minority that actually engaged in the violence. What is striking about it, however, is the fact that the authorities do begin to do something. You can blow up as many black churches as you want to in the 1950s. Nobody gives a damn. No investigations are made. It did when they started blowing up temples in the Atlanta temple, but there were a bunch of other fire bombings and attacks on synagogues. Then finally the FBI begins to get involved. They wouldn't get involved on the racial stuff. But it is surprising. I don't think we think about it as, but the visceral thing for Southerners was always the race thing.
And what was so hard for me to read was how all of that horrible violence was supported by the establishment, by the courts, by the law enforcement, by the justice, if you can call it justice system.
Yeah.
That it didn't just look the other way. It actually supported it. And these people who were clearly guilty of bombing a house and killing people went before a judge, and within 20 minutes or an hour or two, they were dismissed.
Usually what the white establishment wanted was terror and property damage, but they still wouldn't do anything, even when it involved deaths, particularly if it involved the death of a civil rights activist or somebody who was considered uppity or whatever. One of the things that I debated the most about in the book was how much to include. The most horrendous thing that Carter was involved in, he had his own secret Klan group he operated. He called it a strike force. He never took part in any of these violent escapades himself. And I try to explain why that's true in the book. But he set it in motion, told them what to do, and they did it. They were faithful acolytes. They attacked Nat King Cole, for example, when he beat him up when he was performing in Birmingham. Well, that was bad, but he recovered. But in 1957, that's when he really goes too far, and he wants to attack a black minister named Fred Shuttlesworth. He's very activist and very in your face, uppity, black, about as uppity as you can get. But he was heavily surrounded by armed men because they had bombed his house twice and they knew they were trying to kill him. So he wanted to send a message, and he had his men choose a black man at random and castrate him. A guy named Judge Edward Aaron, World War II veteran, black handyman. And
he was just walking along the road one night,
they just
right?
picked him up. He and his girlfriend were walking along the road, and they picked him up and took him to their lair, they called it. And this is a great miscalculation on his part, because it turned out, as the detective investigating it said, this wasn't any civil rights activist. This was just a good old darky, he said, who never bothered white people, and we got to show those Northerners that we're civilized people here. So they went after him, and they ended up convicting the men who did it 20 years, because it was a way of proving that we white Southerners, we'll take care of this. You just let us take care of it. And although Carter was never indicted, everyone knew he was behind it. It was in the newspapers and everything. And that really is what led him to go underground. But what started me on this was when I began writing, I had incredible detail because there were 3 trials that took place, and I had the transcripts of them, and virtually everybody testified. And I was able to put together a minute-by-minute account of that 2 hours of absolute horror. And I wrote it, and I thought, this is too much. It is just too much. It was too much for me to write it, and I don't think anybody can read this thing. And then at the end, I left it in. I think people need, we're not so sensitive we need to know. Just like we don't need to pretend that the Holocaust, when they closed the doors, that was the end of it. We need to know what happened, and we need to know that these were ordinary white men who had been so brainwashed and indoctrinated that they didn't see him as anything other than an object. I mean, he was not a human being that you had to be concerned about at all. He was simply an object. And in this case, an object to intimidate somebody who was stepping out of his place.
It's a gut-wrenching description of what happened. It truly is. But what makes it even more horrible is that they were just having fun.
Yeah, and several of them. One of them was pretty shook up by it, but the rest of them, it was fine. You know, he's just a black guy here. What does it matter about that? As one of the people who testified was not involved in this, said, "Weren't you surprised when your friend did this?" And he said, "Oh, I hear white people saying that ought to be done to all them black bucks," he said, you know. So it was not like it was just, yeah, that was the worst of it with them, but it was this fear of the black rapist, which we don't have time to talk about, but that's actually to me, the most interesting thing about his literary career is that he writes, not The Educational Little Tree, but his other three Western novels are incredibly political and incredibly racist, and yet nobody picked it up. Not one reviewer ever picked up the subliminal racism, the fact that every rapist, every violent, brutal person in those novels is a half-breed Mexican, dark-skinned half-breed Mexican. They were surrogate blacks for him. And he has one description of rape after another by these subhuman Mexican half-breeds. And yet not one reviewer, they talked about how violent it was, but they never saw the connection. So.
What do we take away from this book?
Oh, gosh. I hope enough to buy it. No, I'm not. I'm not really. I'm not at that point. I'm not. To me, it's. I end the book by actually making a kind of leap. My editor may take it out. I don't know, because as you and I have talked about it, one of the books that has affected me so much is Milton Meyer's collection of essays. They thought they were free interviews with Germans who lived through the 30s and into the 40s, and he interviewed them in the early 50s. And there's one guy named Hildebrandt who talks, he was a Latin teacher, and he talks about the way in which the society changes so slowly, so imperceptibly. It didn't happen overnight. And he says, you know, each thing is bad, but it's not that bad. So you think, well, the next one will be so bad that we'll all stand up and do something about this. And then the next one comes, and then the next one. And in his case, he said, this is 1938, I'm sitting at the table, and my son is across from me, and he said, Dad said they came and got all the filthy kikes out of my class today. And he said, it's too late. I sat there quietly and I let this happen, and it's too late. You're in a totalitarian society in which even the bravest of the brave can't raise their head. And I think that's what I think about. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, but I think we've gone in the last 20, 25 years. It hasn't been any single moment. It's just inch by inch, step by step. We accept things that a generation ago we would never have accepted. We would never have accepted somebody jumping up in the middle of a State of the Union address and saying, liar. You would have never accepted on mass media the kind of things that we have today. If you really want to get queasy, read Jane Mayer's recent article just out in the New Yorker. Jane talks about the sliming. There is a whole factory that has now been created with dark money to slime liberals, in which you dig up, you hire investigators and you dig up anything you can find, even if it's minor, and you twist it, and then you use that vast social network to to spread it all out and to get it out and inject it into the political mainstream. And I don't see quite how we're going to stop it. But I keep like Hildebrandt, hoping there's going to become some moment when somebody's going to say, this is too much. We can't do this anymore. But not yet.
Dan Carter, I've always enjoyed our conversations together for what I think people have discovered here tonight. And I want to thank you for all you've done and for sharing some of that with us tonight. Right. And we're not done yet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Jim. Great.
I'd also like to thank Catherine Burley and Doug Wilkes, who have done our sound, along with all of you who have joined us. We hope you'll join us again soon for our next installment of the author series at UUTC. I'm Jim Hardy. Good evening.